They were known as the Plains Indians, and they would spend their summers up in this region. In the wintertime, they were down in New Mexico and Arizona. God got here on the 4th of July. The Indians were already here. And they weren't one bit happy when all these people showed up in their backyard. First week, they found one of the workers with an arrow in his back. The next week, they found a few more people with arrows in their backs. So it was a good thing that the cavalry was coming in right behind Dodge and his crew, and arrived here later during that second week to calm things down with the Indians, at least for a while. But then the cavalry went 3 miles to the north and the west to set up Fort D.A. Russell. The reason they went out 3 miles like that was because in those days there was a law that stated that there was to be no alcoholic beverages served within 3 miles of a military installation. Yeah, right. Fast as the tracks were being laid, trains were coming in hot and heavy right behind them. And they were bringing in prefab wooden buildings and take dancing girls and they would. I've been ahead myself. That's what happens when you don't do this for me. The trains were coming in and they were bringing in prefab wooden buildings. They would have the sides and the bar backs set up, and the dancing girls would be out serving the alcohol before they had roofs on the buildings.
Wow.
Within 4 months, folks, we had 60 saloons and 60 brothels. Wow. This was the Wild West. To the point where several years ago I had a young man on the trolley that was from Tombstone, Arizona. And when they were getting off the trolley, he told me that there was a book that was written about Tombstone, and there was a caption in there, a quote from General Brock Dodge when he was down there. And it stated that a wild day in Tombstone is a mild day in Cheyenne Wyoming. Wow. Yeah. You'll understand little words when people know. Anyhow, as you can well imagine, this was not our first depot. Our first depot was a little wooden building that survived for about a month before it burned to the ground. Wow. Well, they built another wooden depot, and that one survived for close to 20 years. But within that 20 years, Cheyenne was growing by leaps and bounds, thanks to the cattle industry. The cattle barons had come out this way, and they had discovered the vast open prairies that we have here. That was perfect racing for the cattle birds. So they started to homestead their ranches. Then they started to build themselves some fancy houses around town. And then they started to build these fancy buildings downtown. We still had that little wooden depot. Well, Union Pacific, he promised that they were going to build us a nice facility. The time had come. They hooked onto that little wooden depot with a steam engine and chains and drug it over to the side and continued to use it until this facility was up and ready for business. Now in 1979, the Union Pacific stopped using this facility as a passenger stop. Borey, which is west of us, was the closest passenger stop for the Union Pacific. They abandoned this building. They started moving their offices out, and the building ended up standing empty for a few years. And on August 1st of 1985, we had what was determined to be a 100-year flood here in Cheyenne. And the depot's basement sustained an awful lot of water damage. Well, now they just wanted to put this building on the demolition list. But our beautiful old depot had already been put on the National Registry of Beautiful Railroad Depots. So now the only thing anyone can do with our depot is to go inside and enjoy what we have inside. If you haven't been in it yet, we've got a real nice railroad museum inside the depot, but my favorite place in that museum is up on the second floor where there are 2 rooms that have been modeled after the Rocky Mountains. And all those old gold mining towns from back in the day are labeled where they were back in their prime. That's my favorite place to go hide. Just don't tell my boss. When you look across the street to the Albany Restaurant and Liquor Mart, when that building was built, it was built as the Becker Hotel. And when they built it, it was butted up real close to the Phoenix Lodge, which houses the Wrangler here. As Cheyenne was continued in front of the depot, not just behind it. But all these buildings were in the way. Yeah, no problem, says the railroad. We'll just buy the Becker Hotel for the Beckers, who promptly went around the corner and built another Becker Hotel. Now that the railroad owned this building, they had to decide what they were going to do with their newly acquired 3-story brick building. Could have torn it down, but instead they chose to move it. They jacked it up onto rollers, hooked onto it with steam tractors and teams of horses, and drug it inch by inch by inch to where you folks see it standing today. Of course, townsfolk thought that was great entertainment at the time. They were coming out at lunchtime and making bets with each other to see just how far do you think that thing's going to move before it just collapses. Well, as you folks can see, that building made the 44-foot trip very nicely and never lost a grip. And we think we're so clever today. But that's the reason that alley is so much bigger than any other alley you'll find in Cheyenne. Trains would leave town going down that alley. Now, I'm going to kick the heat down for a while. Down the Front Range, as we all know, this side of the trolley knows. Up and down the Front Range, we have very strong winds. 40-mile-an-hour winds in the wintertime, just about a daily occurrence. We don't worry about them at 40-mile-an-hour winds, but when they start pushing 60 and above, yeah, they get our attention real quick. Between the strong winds we have here and sparks from the steam engine, it doesn't take much to set a little wooden building on fire. On January 11th at 1 o'clock in the morning, 1870, we had what they called the Great Disaster Fire. And 70 buildings in downtown Cheyenne burned to the ground. From the ashes, the phoenix shall rise. There she is, folks. She's our phoenix. When this building was built, the first floor was a mercantile. The top 2 floors were the Normandy Hotel. It's been the Wrangler since 1943. It was a family-owned Western wear store. When the family retired, they sold the company to the Corral West Corporation. Several years ago, the Boot Barn bought out the Corral West Corporation and required all the stores to change their name to Boot Barn, except for the Wrangler because of the history that we have in downtown Cheyenne. But I will tell you that if you go into the Wrangler and make a purchase, both your receipt and your bag are going to say Boot Barn. But this will always be our Wrangler. When you look across the street to the north of the Wrangler, you see that big old cinder block building. Well, that was the site of our first post office. It was a little wooden building. Guess what? It burned to the ground. But then we had an escaped slave by the name of Barney Ford come to Cheyenne. He had been born and raised on a plantation in Virginia. As a teenager, he ran away from home and got here by way of the Underground Railroad. He worked in the livery stables, he worked as a janitor, he did whatever he could until he was able to open a small restaurant. His restaurant was very successful. He continued to save his money until he was finally able to build and open the Inner Ocean Hotel on that site across from where the Wrangler is today. Barney built the Inner Ocean and ran it for about 2 years. He then sold the hotel and he went down to Denver, Colorado and built another Inner Ocean Hotel where Coors Field's parking lot is today. He continued, there was a book written about him too. He was quite an achiever. There's, and I can't remember exactly which ski resort it is up in the mountains. But there's still a hotel that he built, a couple of them actually up there. It's quite an interesting character he was. But the property here stood empty for a while. But we had this character around here by the name of Harry Hines. Harry had been a champion bare knuckles fist fighter. He was a gambler, a blacksmith. He drove the Cheyenne Deadwood stage, and he even managed the Plains Hotel, the big blonde hotel you see on the next corner to the east there. When it was first opened in 1911. But Harry got tired of the hotel business. He wanted to do something different. So he built the big cinder block building you see across from the Wrangler today. He built it to be an office building, but he also built it to be a fireproof building. There is no wood in the construction of that building, folks. It's all cement, cinder block, steel, and marble. When we get out on the road, you'll see our Capitol building at the end of Capitol Avenue. One of the secrets that we have around Cheyenne is that we have tunnels that run under Cheyenne. They start at the depot, go straight up Capitol Avenue to the Capitol building, and they're under many of the buildings in downtown Cheyenne. That was one of the ways they helped to heat the Capitol when it was first opened in 1888. They would force steam from all those steam engines up the tunnels towards the house. Yeah, you know how people say that, oh, come winter, your allergies will go away? No, they don't. So if I cough, sneeze, or blow my nose, honest, it's allergies, I know. The only access to our tunnels today, though, is for inspection. Now, before we get out of here, I have a question for you. Has anyone heard of a cowboy by the name of Tom Horn? Okay. Well, Tom Horn was one of our infamous characters, and as you're living here, you'll eventually hear more about Tom Horn from different areas and different places. Tom was one of our infamous characters, but he was my favorite character. He had been with Teddy Roosevelt and Teddy's Rough Riders down in Cuba. He was an Indian scout for the Army around Texas area. He was a lawman and a Pinkerton detective agent in New Mexico and in Colorado. And he came to Cheyenne to get a fresh start on life. He hired on as a cattle detective with the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. We didn't have fencing in those days, so the cattlemen would just brand their cattle, turn them all out on the prairie to graze together, and it worked very well for them. But it was also very easy pickings for the cattle rustlers to pick up some stray head of cattle and change the brand. Tom's job was to get those stolen cattle back and return back to their proper owners. Now, when Tom Horn caught up with the cattle rustler, he wasn't very nice. He'd shoot the rustler, lay a rock under the man's head, take the cattle, return them back to where they belong. Plain and simple, no muss, no fuss. When the Cattlemen's Association found a dead rustler with a rock under his head, they knew that that had been a Tom Horn kill and to pay Tom for his services. That was a different way of life in the early days.
Mm-hmm.
Back in those days, the cattlemen and the sheep herders didn't get along at all. And there was a family by the name of Nickel that had come to this area, and they were raising sheep. Well, it was a cold, dreary, rainy July morning when 14-year-old Willie Nickel was out doing chores for his dad. He was wearing his dad's hat and coat and riding his dad's horse. And someone came up behind Willie and shot him in the back.
Wow.
And laid a flat rock under Willie's head. So, of course, it was assumed that it was Tom Horn that had shot Willie in the back. Tom was invited to come into town for what he thought was going to be a job interview. And he met up with Sheriff Smalley and U.S. Marshal Joe LaFleur in the bar that was at the Interocean Hotel over yonder there at that time. From there, they went to Joe LaFleur's office, which was on the second floor. I can't believe those guys don't have even jackets on. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
They're still in culture shock.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm sorry. Anyhow, they went up to Joe LaFleur's office, which was on the second floor of what is today the Wyoming Home Building. And they went to the room on the second floor that has a big bay window in it. Today, the side windows say U.S. Marshal 1902. It didn't say that back then. Tom Horn was a drinker and he was a bragger. And they started to pour him whiskey, and the more whiskey they poured him, the more he bragged. Till somebody asked him, "What about that Willie Nickel kid?" Tom's response was, "Yeah, I could have taken that shot. That would have been the best shot I ever made in my life, but that would have been the meanest trick I ever could have pulled." Unbeknownst to Tom, there was a man in the next room, just on the other side of the door, writing down every word that Tom said.
Wow.
But that statement was only partially written down. And what they wrote down was, "Best shot I ever made and the meanest trick I ever pulled." Tom had been set up. And that's what got Tom Horn arrested, tried, convicted, and hung for the murder of 14-year-old Willie Nickel. There were a lot of folks in town didn't believe that he had done that deed because that was not his style. He'd look you dead in the eye and shoot you in the heart, but he wouldn't shoot you in the back. Several years later, there was a man who on his deathbed confessed to having been the man that had shot Willie in the back, having mistaken Willie for his father. And it happened to be their neighboring rancher.
Wow.
Tom Horn was the last man legally hung in the state of Wyoming. I emphasize legally because this was still the Wild West. And the vigilante gangs were still very active and the hangings were a very common occurrence. But let's get out of here and go wander around town. And the other three people that were supposed to join us, culture shock. Couldn't handle the wind. Missionary. It was a vaudeville theater for many, many years. And Atlas's windows. If you look over here to your right, you see the Wyoming Home Building, and right here on this sandstone pillar between those two big windows, you see the Tom Horn plaque. Directly above the Tom Horn plaque on the second floor is the bay window where they took Tom for what he get down the back staircase into the tunnel and come out over here to the Idleman Hotel.
Wow.
Mama would never know what he did, right? Oh, that me. Mama always finds out what's going on sooner or later. Might be 20 years later, but Mama usually finds out. The Idleman. So Esther Hobart Morris came into town from South Pass City where she lived, which is about 250 miles west and north of us. And she addressed the territorial legislature group that was meeting in the building that was on this corner here on the right at that time. And she told them, you know, if you give women the right to vote, you'll make your quota for statehood. Well, the men thought she was joking. She wasn't. As you can see from our mural there on the side of that building, Esther and a couple of her friends got all the ladies in town together. And they picketed in front of the governor's house for 4 days.
Oh, wow.
Until he finally got the hint that maybe you better give these women the right to vote if you want to keep his happy home. First lady in this country cast her vote on September 6th of 1870 over in Laramie, Wyoming, which is just about 40 miles straight west of us. 30 minutes later, the next lady in this country cast her vote right here in Cheyenne. Our nation's capital didn't like what we had done, so they passed a law stating that criminals, imbeciles, and women were not allowed to vote. Well, that was pretty rude, but we really didn't care because we had already given women the right. However, it did cost us becoming a state until 1890 when we finally became the 44th state in the country. Now, all along the track lane route, about every 20 miles, you would come across a little tent town. That's how Cheyenne started. And those tent towns were called Hell on Wheels towns. Well, Cheyenne lived up to that reputation in a big way. In our first year of existence, we had over 100 murders.
Wow.
And we had 22 documented vigilante gangs. Their favorite place to hang folks was out east of town in what is today Holiday Park. When they hung Tom Horn, however, the city made a big deal about Tom's hanging. And they sent out 100 monogrammed invitations inviting folks to come watch Tom Horn hang.
Wow.
Well, when they hung Tom, it happened to be in November. Now, typically, November in these parts is not a month where you want to go stand outside and watch somebody swing from the rope. And on this particular day, it happened to be snowing and blowing. So they moved the hanging from outside to the basement of our old city county building, which was right here on this corner on the left at that time. As I said earlier, there were a lot of folks who didn't believe it Tom had done that deed. Two of those people were the Irvin brothers, who were two of the cattle barons that Tom had worked for. And they sang hymns at the foot of Tom's gallows, waiting for that trap door to drop open and Tom fall to his death. If you've noticed all of the bronze statues that we have on the corners, well, this one right here on our left is of Tom Horn. With all the murder and mayhem and the brothels and saloons that we have here, folk have some St. Mark's Episcopal Church up here on the left was built by wealthy cattlemen. And when they were through building the church, they still had a lot of this beautiful rose stone left over. So they decided they ought to have a bell tower. They hired 2 Swedish master stonemasons to build this bell tower. Being from Sweden, these guys didn't speak English very well, so the communication was a little. And one day there was only one stonemason that showed up for work. Well, of course, he was asked, "Where's your partner?" He just shrugged. 3 days later, though, he was a no-show for work. And they couldn't get anyone to stay long enough to finish building this tower. Folks would come, they'd work for 3, maybe 5 days, and they would all leave saying that there's something very uncomfortable in that area. It's really creepy and even a little spooky. Took over 35 years before they finally got someone to finish putting, or to put real effort into finishing this tower. They went back to the stone quarry where they had gotten the original stone, and they were told by the quarry, "We're sorry folks, but we've been out of that stone for a long time." They did the best they could, but when you look up towards the top of that bell tower, you can see the stone gets darker.
Oh, yeah.
The higher up you look,
Yeah.
the darker that stone gets. Now in 1966, the church received a letter that had been written by a very old Swedish stonemason on his deathbed in South America. When the church opened the letter and read it, it stated that I was one of the original stonemasons working on your bell tower. And I can't go to meet my maker without telling what I know. While my partner and I were working on scaffolding, my partner slipped and fell and broke his neck. Being a foreigner, not speaking the language very well, I was afraid that I would be accused of having murdered my partner. So I shored him up in the walls of the bell tower.
Oh my gosh.
As soon as the church got this information, they had the walls where the Swedes had worked x-rayed. And they did find some remnants of bone.
Wow.
Being respectful of the dead, they left well enough alone.
Right.
But that might explain why that bell you see on display for us right here, that was the original bell up in the bell tower.
Wow.
And it started to ring in the middle of the night for no apparent reason, and there was no one around. Now that bell weighs 600 pounds. It's not that it was just our strong winds that caused it to ring. But I don't know for sure. I do know though that the church said that's enough of that nonsense, and they brought the bell down and put it on display for us here. But I will promise you folks this, if that puppy ever starts to ring again in the middle of the night and there's no one around, there'll be a mass exodus of about 2 blocks around this church. As we go through this intersection, if you look down to your right to the next corner, you'll see the First United Methodist Church. They built in September of 1867, when the church had saved enough money to be able to build this beautiful church they have now. They drug the little wooden church out to the middle of the street here and continued having services in their little wooden church for 3 more years until this church, beautiful church was up and ready for services. We all remember Wild Bill Hickok. Well, he and Calamity Jane spent many an hour bellied up to the bars in the saloons in Cheyenne. Calamity Jane was very much in love with Bill Hickok, but he was in love with a trapeze artist by the name of Agnes Lake Thatcher, who would come through town with a traveling circus. Bill and Agnes decided they wanted to get married, so they asked the minister of that Methodist church back there if he would do the honors, and he said, of course. But Bill wanted to get married at a friend's house, not in the church. Minister finally said, okay. After the wedding, the minister wrote in the church diaries that he didn't mind marrying Bill and Agnes at their friend's house because he didn't think that Wild Bill Hickok really meant it. Well, we'll never know for sure, folks, because 5 months later, Wild Bill Hickok was shot in the back, holding that dead man's hand of black aces and eights. Agnes went back to the circus and continued to perform until she retired. When Esther Hobart Morris retired, however, she came back to Cheyenne, and she lived the last 12 years of her life in this little yellow cottage up here on the left. Right here on the left, this was Esther's house. Now, Esther wasn't just a woman suffragette. She was also this country's first woman to be appointed as a judge. And her first act as Justice of the Peace, she had her husband arrested for drunken disorderly conduct. Yeah, he did mess around with it. On the other side of this intersection, this big building here on the right, is Court Building. One of the murder trials they had there in the very early days had a young man as a witness. And they got this young man up on the witness stand and told him to tell us just exactly what did you witness. Well, someone handed him the gun that was used in the murder. And he was on the witness stand swinging this gun around, just like he'd witnessed. And the judge looked at him and said, "Stop. Has anyone checked to see if this gun is loaded?" No, Your Honor. No one had checked the gun. Someone took the gun from the young man, cracked it open, spun the barrel, closed it again, handed it back to the young man, turned to the judge and said, "Yes, Your Honor, the gun is loaded." The judge looked at the young man and said, "Son, if you're going to swing that gun around anymore, please point it at the lawyers." They wrote that in the court dockets like that, folks. That was a different way of life in the early days, for sure. Our Capitol building is straight ahead of us. The gold dome is made of 24-karat gold leaf. The end caps were added on in 2 stages. The first stage was added on by a local builder by the name of Moses Keefe. Moses was given a lot of inferior quality stone to use in adding on the end caps. He refused to use that stone, but it didn't go to waste because he gave it to a friend of his. Our Capitol building was closed for 3 years, undergoing complete restoration back to its glory days of when it was first built. They ripped down all that old sheetrock and dropped ceilings and touched up all the beautiful artwork on the walls and the ceilings. Today it's open for self-guided tours Monday through Friday, free to the public. So if you want to see a beautifully restored historic building, boy, that's a joy to wander through. This building on the left, this big mansion, is the Eidelman Mansion. You remember those guys from downtown, right? Well, there are 8 fireplaces in that house, 4 on the first floor and 4 on the second floor. The quarter circle windows you see on the 3rd floor is where they had their ballroom.